When I think Halloween, a lot of things come to mind. Jack-o'-lanterns, witches, vampires, and somewhere on that list, of course, killer clowns. But in the last few years, it's been one in particular, and he is quickly rising to the top of that list. His name? Art. You probably know him from the Terrifier series, but he actually got his start 8 years earlier in Damien Leone's short film, The Ninth Circle. Killer clowns are nothing new. The most infamous is probably Pennywise, the dancing clown of Stephen King's It. But there are plenty of others, including one of my favorites, killer clowns from outer space. Yet somehow, Art manages to stand apart from the rest. There is something which makes this particular killer special. Tonight, I intend to find out what exactly it is, by staring evil right in its clown face, by recapping and reviewing every movie featuring Art the Clown so far. This will also be great prep for the upcoming Terrifier 3. After Art's 2008 debut in The Ninth Circle, Leone brought him back for another short in 2011, which he called Terrifier, then included both as segments in the horror anthology All Hallows Eve, his 2013 feature directorial debut. So that is where we begin tonight's descent. Join me if you dare, but I make no promises you'll leave with your sanity intact. On the contrary, I make only one promise. Tonight, you will see the face of evil, and for some, it will surely result in a permanent state of madness. In fact, I've had to censor certain parts of the recaps, but rest assured, this is done in your own interest. Now, let us watch 2013's All Hallows Eve. But first, with Halloween coming up, it is officially spooky season, and you want to hear something really scary? Imagine you're in the mood to watch one of your favorite horror movies. You walk over to your shelf where you keep your DVDs and Blu-rays, only to find out some ghouls have stolen half of them. Sounds crazy, right? But actually, Netflix does that to you every day. They have a huge catalog, but you can only watch a fraction of it, because they offer different shows and movies depending on the country you're in. That's where private internet access can help. As a VPN, they let you overcome those restrictions by giving you the option to change your IP address to one of 91 countries they offer. For example, The Shining is one of my favorite horror movies, but I've seen it a million times. So this Halloween, I want to check out the sequel, Dr. Sleep. Only it isn't on Netflix. Until I change my IP location to Tokyo, and now it's there. In addition to changing your location, PIA also helps protect your personal data by encrypting your internet connection through a world-class server infrastructure, which makes your information shielded and bulletproof. Something you want, especially when you're on a public Wi-Fi network. By using my link in the description at piavpn.com/onetake, you can get 83% off on private internet access. That's just $2.03 a month, and you also get 4 extra months completely free. For only $2, you can unlock so much content and protect your digital life. And now, on to 2013's All Hallows Eve. It's Halloween night. Tia and Timmy come home from trick-or-treating when they find something strange in their candy bag, an unmarked tape, apparently handed out at one of the houses without their notice. The babysitter, Sarah, refuses to play it, until she relents after enough begging, but if it gets out of control, she will shut it off. Sarah inserts the tape, hits play, and a scary movie begins. It starts at a train station. Casey is waiting, at first alone, but soon she is joined by a clown. At first he's a nuisance, but he becomes much more than that once he injects her with the needle. She wakes up underground in chains. There are 2 other women there, Sarah and Kristen. They tell her what happened to the other girl. She was dragged down the tunnel by her chains, screaming for her life. Any one of them could be next. That turns out to be Sarah. Now only the 2 of them remain. Casey convinces Kristen their only hope is to follow the chains down the tunnel to try and find a way out. Along the way, they run into a disfigured but human-shaped monster. Casey escapes when the monster's cleaver breaks her chains, but Kristen isn't so lucky. Casey runs for help, but quickly finds that monster wasn't the only one around. She is captured and strapped to a table, surrounded by a coven of witches, and a bloody ritual involving a demon, or perhaps the devil himself, unfolds. And things have officially gotten out of control. Sarah shuts off the TV and sends the kids to bed. Now alone, curiosity gets the better of her. She turns the TV back on and starts the next tale. This one concerns a woman named Caroline, who has just moved into a new home. She already loves it. The only problem is that painting, the one her husband John recently did. It's different from his usual stuff. This one is strange and unsettling, and John has no memory of even painting it, like he was in a trance. Caroline keeps it covered by a sheet. But that night, while John is out, that painting becomes the least of her worries, because that night she is visited by an extraterrestrial. It starts with a power outage and something landing outside, but soon the humanoid thing is in the house. It attacks. She fights it off and runs upstairs. She hides until it emits a powerful signal. Her nose bleeds, and the unbearable pain in her skull forces out a scream. Now it knows where to find her. It attacks again. When it reveals a wriggling creature in its hand, she yanks a tube from its mask, disorienting the being. She runs to a new hiding spot. This time, it's her ringing phone that gives her away. Her cell service disappeared when the alien showed up. Now it has suddenly returned, and John is calling. The alien drags her out of the house, screaming. She grabs for anything she can, the only thing in reach, the sheet which covered John's painting. The painting of a clown. Of course, Sarah recognizes him, the same clown who captured women for that coven of witches. She shuts off the TV and spots a figure around the corner. It must be one of the kids, but both are in bed. Tia apparently joined Timmy after hearing a strange noise from her closet. Sarah is starting to feel scared herself, and how can she convince a child not to be afraid if she herself is too chicken to finish that tape? She hits play. The final segment begins. This story concerns a woman driving alone at night, 1 minute after the witching hour, officially Halloween. It's then she notices her dwindling fuel. Time to stop for gas. She arrives at the station just in time to see the clown. The attendant kicked him out after finding what he did in the bathroom, smearing on the walls what is typically reserved for the toilet. The attendant threatens to call the cops, and the clown leaves. After that, the attendant fills her tank and gives her directions to the interstate, until he hears a noise inside and goes to investigate. When he doesn't return, she heads in after him. She finds the clown crouching over his body with a saw. She runs back to her car and drives off. She calls the police until, stop me if you've heard this before, she loses service. And out there on the road, she sees him again. The clown on the side of the road waving for her to stop. Of course, she keeps driving, but in her panicked state, almost hits an oncoming van and veers off the road. She gathers her wits until the clown is at her window. She drives again, only stopping when she finds another car on the side of the road. She runs to it, calling for help, and sees the driver barely alive, his hands removed, his face a bloody pulp. She gets back in her car and drives, until the clown reveals himself in her back seat. She slams on the brakes, thrusting him into the front panel. She escapes the vehicle and runs until she finds a shed. She locks it from the inside and hides. It does keep him out, until he gets the idea to dig his way in, and now he's locked it from the outside. There is no longer any escape. He cuts her with a weapon of his own design, a whip-like thing covered in sharp objects. But during the whipping, one of those sharp things comes loose, so she takes it and sticks it in his eye, then his back. She runs back to the road and flags down a car. The driver picks her up. He heads quickly toward the police station, until another car catches up with them. The clown is back. He shoots the Good Samaritan. Their car veers off the road and crashes. By the time she comes to, the clown has already removed her arm. She sees what he did to her and screams, and the clown laughs. Sarah shuts off the TV. She is officially done with that tape, but it, apparently, is not done with her. The TV turns back on. The clown approaches the screen and bangs on it, as though trying to break out into the real world. Then it flickers to an image of Sarah herself, with the clown behind her. She quickly destroys the tape and the clown is gone, until a scream from upstairs. She runs to find him, pointing and laughing at the children's room. Inside the room, she finds the children's... and on the wall, he has signed his name in blood. Art. I'll be honest, I was skeptical before I started this movie. It never made it to theaters, it was straight to DVD and digital, and I hardly ever hear it mentioned when people talk about Terrifier. But the movie starts with a wraparound plot that connects the short films, and it's totally fine. The interaction between Sarah and the two kids is written, acted, and shot in a naturalistic way. You don't get much in the way of character development, and you don't really expect it in an anthology where each character gets such limited screen time. But Sarah, Tia, and Timmy feel like three real human beings. And when they find an unmarked VHS tape, my curiosity is immediately piqued. Who gave them that tape? What's on it? And like The Ring, will playing it have consequences? It's also relatable to anyone who grew up in a house with a VCR. And if that sounds like a ridiculous sentence to you, sorry for the reminder that we're getting older, and I assume a lot of people today have never even seen a VCR. But remember the feeling of finding an old tape without a label? There was always such curiosity sticking it into the VCR, hitting play, then sitting back and waiting to find out what's on it. It's a great start that also helps set a retro tone, harkening back to the 70s and 80s, a time in horror movie history that Leone clearly reveres. In fact, in the Terrifier short, he even added digital artifacts like scratches to make the footage look older. We'll come back to the wraparound story, but how about the shorts themselves? First up is The Ninth Circle, Leone's short which first introduces Art the Clown. He has a minor but memorable role in the movie, and once again, it's something relatable. You're alone at a train or bus station at night when you feel vulnerable and you think this would be the worst time to run into a strange person, the perfect time for Art to show up. And of course, setting this tale on Halloween night means Casey can justify in her mind why this clown is here. It's just a guy in a costume, perfectly normal for All Hallows Eve. That means Leone can draw more tension out of the sequence, because Art doesn't just pop out and attack. First, he can make her and us uncomfortable with his silent staring and grinning, then his blatant taunting. On any other night, maybe Casey would run out of the station right then and there, but on Halloween night, this clown isn't a killer, he's just a jerk in a costume. The longer Leone can draw this out, the longer we can feel uncomfortable. But of course, too long risks boredom or stretching credulity. How long would someone really put up with this? I think he hits the sweet spot. Once she's underground, the short takes a major tonal shift. I no longer feel tension like in a slasher, where it's a game of cat and mouse between killer and potential victim. At this point, I only feel dread. She's chained up, underground, I don't see any hope of escape, and like the title, The Ninth Circle, suggests, heading down the tunnel, following the tracks, just feels like descending further into hell. There is a moment of hope when the chain breaks, but shortly after that, the final destination, that satanic ritual. It's a more interesting end than simply killing the victim. It leaves us with a more nightmarish memory, captive, underground, surrounded by ghouls and witches, all rendered practically. Some of them, though, especially the devil or demon himself, look a little cheesy, like something you might see in an episode of Buffy the Vampire Slayer. I think it was a good choice at this point to start cutting back to reality, almost like admitting, yeah, none of what you're seeing is real. Remember, it's just a tape, so don't judge too harshly. But it does salvage some discomfort by cutting to the young boy, Timmy. As the gruesomeness unfolds, he has such a captivated look on his face. I don't read any particular malice in that, like he's a serial killer in the making or anything, more just an uncomfortable reminder of that innate morbid curiosity we have, even at a young age. In the end, I find this first short to be an effectively unpleasant experience. On its own, I'd probably question its utility, because there are a few reasons we watch horror movies. Sometimes it's for a thrill ride that gets your adrenaline pumping, but for the most part, this isn't that. It's more of a slow descent into hell, and usually that isn't a ride I take unless it's for some grander purpose, an interesting subtext or theme, or just to stretch the imagination, show me something truly bizarre and unsettling. That would at least fulfill that morbid curiosity. As a segment in this anthology, though, the short serves its purpose as something awful to create tension between Sarah and Timmy. The more horrific it can be in the end without redeeming qualities, the more believable that Sarah would argue with the boy over allowing him to continue watching the tape, and the more believable their minds would start playing tricks on them. The tone of the movie also becomes a little more dynamic after that first short, even becoming a little melancholy when Sarah checks on Tia. The girl is scared, and the babysitter tries to reassure her that those things she saw on screen are just in the movies, they aren't real. There's a quiet synth score that plays underneath which captures that feeling, a frightened child, and trying to find the right words to help them understand the world. It's an emotional moment I didn't expect, especially from the wraparound story. I figured it would just be the bare minimum necessary to justify the screening of those 3 short films. But moments like these give more texture to their little world, and connects us more with them. How about the second tale? This one only features Art as a painting, and honestly, he feels a little shoehorned in. The first and last story featuring the clown already existed before this movie, so I think for the middle tale, Leone wanted to do something a little different, and I wonder if he just felt obligated to include Art in some fashion so it would fit the anthology theme. This one starts a lot like the first story, a woman alone at night, but this time in her own home. And this time the perpetrator isn't an evil clown, but an evil space alien. This story is also a bit more of a roller coaster, with Caroline fighting for her life. At various points, it even seems like she might escape with it. But there's one big problem with this story, and this is where the limits of a low budget meet reality. The alien looks goofy, especially when he's slowly waving his arms to appear alien, but instead just looks like a guy, wiggling his arms in slow motion. The behind-the-scenes story is that they meant to use a puppet, but literally found out in the middle of filming it wasn't going to work, so they had to come up with a plan B. There are moments when the lighting is just right and the alien is obscured enough where it looks kind of creepy, and there are moments of real tension. But when the most unique element of the story doesn't work, this becomes your average, cheesy slasher, with a subplot about a painting that doesn't fit the rest of the story. It does create the first inklings of a mythology behind Art. If Caroline's husband felt compelled to draw that clown in a trance, it implies some kind of evil force bigger than one clown. But there isn't enough to it that you believe there's a mythology. Instead, like I said, it just feels like a convenient way to insert the clown into a story where he doesn't belong. Speaking of characters ending up where they don't belong, the next interstitial hints that these stories are beginning to escape the confines of that tape. When Sarah spots a figure around the corner, if you pause on the frame, you'll see that figure is the alien. By this point, you get the idea. Sarah and the children might find themselves in danger by the end of the movie, and it adds tension when she hits play on the third story. You can almost feel the moment she hits that button, it's a death sentence. This is one of the few examples I can think of where the interstitials of an anthology act as more than just introductions to the stories. These ones actually elevate the stories to an extent and make them feel more dangerous. The final story is really the one we all came here for. This is Leone's short film, Terrifier, the one where Art really gets his start. As more than a henchman for a satanic cult or coven of witches, here we see the prototype of the killer who is about to get his own series. It's also where we really start to see those special ingredients, which have made Art stand out among the crowd of slasher villains. First, you have to understand the basic slasher formula, which is really just a specific application of the suspense formula. Generally, suspense is when we as an audience fear looming danger. In the case of a slasher, the killer. To make us fear that danger, we need at least two things. Knowledge of that danger. That's partly why slashers often start with a kill before the protagonist is even introduced. And yeah, we need a protagonist or protagonists, people we care about and fear for. A good slasher will usually draw out the collision of these two things. A killer will slowly make their way through victims throughout the runtime. Each kill is its own exercise in suspense, but more broadly, we're waiting and worrying as they close in on the main character, the one we're really worried about. To say there's a formula might sound demeaning, because it means you can check a few boxes and call it a day. To be fair, plenty of movies have done that and cashed a big check, but the ones that really stand out bring something fresh to the table, because often a big element of fear is the unknown. If you see the same thing enough times, it becomes familiar, and some of that fear dissipates. Once you've seen the same killer 10 times, you recognize the formula, and you can write the rest of the movie in your head, it's hard to feel immersed and feel the same fear you might have felt the first time you met Jason Voorhees, Michael Myers, or countless others. So the existence of that formula poses a challenge: familiarity. How do you make slashers scary today? One way is by playing it straight. Recognizing the played out formula, a lot of slashers today borrow from Scream by winking at the audience and aiming for a more comedic tone. So today, taking yourself seriously is starting to feel fresh again, and that's exactly what Leone does with Terrifier. Sure, it's all a hoot. To Art the Clown, he laughs plenty, and sometimes we might laugh too. But Leone always makes a point of getting back to brass tacks. We are watching some awful things unfold. There's also room to be inventive, even while you're coloring between the lines. The most obvious place is in the villain, and Art is a clever one. We've seen plenty of killer clowns, but making him a mime is pretty genius. That lets him combine the mystique of a Michael Myers with the fun of a Freddy Krueger, and of course there's the way he kills. We'll see more of it in the feature and sequel, but already in this short, we see that he goes too far. When the main character finds the gas attendant, she doesn't just find a dead body, she finds Art hard at work. He's already dismembered him in various ways and is now meticulously working on removing his head. We've seen hints of this in other movies too, where the killer will leave a mutilated body behind, but to actually see him carrying out the work in a totally matter-of-fact way while dressed as a clown, that starts to feel a little more fresh and disturbing. I also have to mention the clown's, what's a polite way to put this? His scatological humor. We overhear from the attendant that Art relieved himself all over the place in the bathroom and smeared his name on the wall with, you get the idea. Hey, if you're looking for something new, I don't see Jason, Michael, or even Pennywise doing that. And it does feel like the sort of thing an unhinged person might do, the sort of thing they might find funny and enjoy inflicting on the poor guy who has to clean it up as their last act before shuffling off this mortal coil. In the slasher formula, there are a few variables to pick out. We talked a little about who and what, but there's also where. Often that'll be in places like the victim's home, where the killer is invading what should be a safe space. Then sometimes toward the end of the movie, you'll get to a final showdown that's more in the killer's domain. But like the Ninth Circle, Terrifier begins in a place that already feels unsafe and uncomfortable, in a way we can all relate to, driving alone late at night. When you stop for gas and have to actually get out of the car, now you're alone in a strange place at night. There's already a feeling of isolation before Art even shows up, and it devolves into a nightmarish isolation once he does. When she drives off from the gas station and sees him on the side of the road asking for a ride, or when she almost crashes and finds him at her window, there's a balancing act. You need the killer to stalk their prey and draw out the tension. And in theory, the closer that killer gets to the victim, the more you crank up that tension. But of course, when they get too close, you need to maintain credulity by either having the stalker kill their victim or have the character escape and get away. But have them get away too many times or too easily, and you undercut how scary that killer can actually be. This setup, Art outside and her in the car, lets you play a little cat and mouse while still making it believable she can escape a couple of times. Finally, I already mentioned the kills themselves, and even with the main character, Leone does not hold back. He goes to a level of brutality that would make Voorhees blush. I censored this out during the recap, but I think in the context of commentary, without any images, YouTube will be okay with me describing what happened at a high level. So he amputated all of her limbs and carved obscenities into what remains of her body. It's horrible and disgusting, especially the extra touch of those derogatory words. It takes things a step further from the other guy who loves amputations, Jigsaw. And of course, there's the fact that she's still alive at the end of it, screaming. There is a risk of going too far, because if your movie is just an exercise in cruelty, it can be effective at being unpleasant, something nobody would choose to watch. That line is obviously subjective. For me, this movie doesn't cross it all the way. It might get close if it went on longer, but as a 20-minute burst of awfulness, it works. And the conclusion, Art escaping the TV. This works well as a final gotcha because it's the ultimate violation of space. When we watch a killer in one of these movies enter someone's home, it's uncomfortable to imagine the same thing happening to you. You get paranoid. Maybe after watching the movie, you glance over your shoulder or behind corners a couple extra times, just to be safe. In this movie, Art comes out of the TV after Sarah watches those shorts, and that's exactly what we just did. Then, in the spirit of taking things further than most slashers dare, Leone crosses a line and inverts things. Usually, babysitters are the number one target in slashers.
Babysitting on Halloween night? That's just asking for trouble.
But Art isn't after her. No, Art the Clown goes after the children. Of course, it's effective as a gut punch, but it's also kind of cheating, because it's an easy way to horrify. Even if you flub character development or tension building, seeing harm come to children touches a primal nerve. At the same time, I can't deny it feels like the right ending to this movie, because it does leave me with that sensation. Art is the villain who is here to show the other slashers what it really means to be the bad guy. Like when Eric Cartman met Bart Simpson.
I'm a pretty bad kid.
Really? What's the worst thing you've ever done?
I stole the head off a statue once.
Wow, that's pretty hardcore. Jeez. That's like this one time when I didn't like a kid, so I ground his parents up into chili and fed it to him.
Overall, All Hallows Eve is uneven. The first short is a good tone setter, but nothing all that special. The second one about the alien is pretty rough. But the final short, Terrifier, is a successful experiment with the slasher formula that risks going too far and alienating anyone who doesn't consider themselves a hardcore horror fan. But come on, if you're watching this video, you're hardcore. Well, now that we've met Art the Clown and he's made quite the first impression, let's see what he can do with his own feature. Up next is 2016's Terrifier. 1 year ago, Art the Clown perpetrated what has become known as the Miles County Massacre. Tonight, Monica Brown interviews its sole survivor, a woman whose face, or at least what's left of it, tells much of the story all on its own. Reconstructive surgery could only do so much after what Art did to her. But the woman assures the clown is very dead, despite reports he disappeared from the morgue. Art himself watches the interview. He kicks the TV at the insinuation of his mortal end and prepares to kill again, putting on his makeup, stocking his garbage bag with sharp objects. The interview makes Monica uncomfortable. Then it makes her afraid when the woman lurches forward suddenly as though to attack. And Monica is right to be afraid, because in her dressing room after the interview, that woman does attack, and she laughs a mad laugh. On Halloween night, Tara and Dawn will meet the clown. They could have gone straight home, but Dawn was too drunk to drive. Tara took the keys and realized so was she. Pizza, that's what they needed. After that, Tara would be sober enough. That's when Art spots them, and they spot him. Dawn toys with the clown, but Tara isn't so sure that's a good idea. In either case, he leaves as quickly as he arrived, and joins them again at Deer Hill's Pizzeria. He stares. He smiles. He even buys Tara a plastic ring. Dawn is amused by it all. The shop owner, on the other hand, is decidedly unamused once he sees what Art did in the bathroom and what he used to smear his name on the wall. Finally, he kicks the clown out of there. When Tara and Dawn get back to the car, the front right tire is flat, and Dawn's been driving on the spare. With Tara's phone battery dead, she borrows Dawn's and calls her sister Vicky to pick them up. In the meantime, they wait in the car. Art, on the other hand, busies himself slaughtering the pizza shop owner and his employee. He makes a human jack-o'-lantern of one, and is less creative with the other, but no less brutal. At the car, Tara still worries about the clown, and a new problem. She has to pee, and possibly an answer. The guy standing outside the creepy building. He turns out to be an exterminator about to bomb the place for rats. He kindly allows her to use the bathroom first, the clearly long-neglected bathroom. Outside, Dawn hears on the radio about the murders at Deer Hill Pizzeria, so she knows the trouble she's in when the door opens, and the clown sits down in the passenger seat. Tara makes her way out of the building until she hears a baby crying, though it sounds more like growling when she gets close, and she finds a woman cradling a doll, speaking as though it is her child. The woman welcomes Tara as her new neighbor. Tara politely excuses herself and leaves, but blocking the exit is that clown, holding a bloody scalpel. Tara runs and hides as best she can, until the sharp pain in her leg tells her she's been found. Art puts the scalpel in her leg a few times before she manages to fight him off. She arms herself with a metal rod and hides again. She tosses a small object to create a distraction and escapes. She gets upstairs and finds a phone. Dead, of course. She finds the exterminator and calls for help. With music blasting through the buds in his ears, he doesn't turn around. He doesn't see the clown injecting that needle into her neck. Tara wakes up tied to a chair and stays quiet after the clown threatens her. Then he reveals what's behind the curtain. Her friend Dawn, hanging upside down. Of course, Tara breaks the cardinal rule and screams when Art takes the saw and... There's no hope of saving Dawn. But with the clown distracted, Tara breaks free of her own restraints and begins another round of clown and mouse. She knocks him down with a wooden plank, and it seems she's bested him until Art reveals a simple, dirty trick. A pistol. The woman with the doll sees what he's done and runs upstairs to the exterminator for help. She begs him to call the police. He doesn't believe her insane ramblings and instead calls his boss, though can't get a word out before Art knocks him out with a hammer. Returning downstairs, the woman looks for her baby and soon finds the doll in the clown's arms. She cautiously approaches him and begs him to spare the plastic girl. She asks if he's ever felt a mother's touch, and she shows it to him. She cradles him, and he sucks his thumb like a child. By now, Vicky is in the building. She doesn't find her dead sister, but she does find Dawn's remains. She runs until she sees a woman reaching up for help, but it's a trick. Art has made a makeshift wig of that woman's hair. He wears her chest, too. Vicky runs, while Art follows in his best imitation of a feminine gait. He finds her hiding in a closet, but is distracted by the arrival of the exterminator's boss. The clown makes short work of him, then continues to stalk his prey. Vicky escapes their next encounter, and finally finds her sister in a macabre display, stringed lights, and a circus sign. That's when Art attacks with some of those sharp objects from his bag. But she escapes again when the exterminator arrives and knocks the clown out. In the next room they call the police, then make their way out of the building. But the clown wakes up. He attacks the exterminator, and this time makes sure he won't be a problem again. Then he gets a hold of Vicky. She stabs the clown in the eye, escapes the building, and finds another with the door chained shut. But she just barely manages to squeeze through the opening. Art tries to get in himself, but can't quite fit through the doorway. Instead, he drives a pickup truck through it, knocking Vicky unconscious in the process. By the time the cops find her, the clown is crouching over her, still in the process of eating her face. The cops shout for the clown to show his hands. Instead, he takes that pistol and points it at himself. It would seem Art the Clown has met his end on his own terms, until the lights flicker at the morgue, and despite the wound in his head, the clown wakes up. As for Vicky, after some reconstructive surgery and a 1-year stay at the hospital, she is ready to go home. And she is ready for that interview with Monica Brown. A twist! It turns out that everything we watched is a flashback. The woman being interviewed is Vicky, and that interview takes place 1 year after Art's attack. The other twist is that the supernatural is at work here, which is probably more of a surprise if you skip All Hallows Eve, but one-takers do their homework. No stone is left unturned here, no matter how grimy and disgusting it is under those stones. I've seen some disappointed by that supernatural twist, but I actually appreciate it. On the commentary track, Leone describes it as not lying to the audience. He already knew he was going to make a sequel, so it felt disingenuous to say, Art is dead and gone. So rather than go the traditional slasher route of having the killer resurrected at the start of the sequel, either by supernatural means or by a contrivance like the wounds weren't as bad as you thought and he lived. Instead, Leone puts it right at the end of the first movie. And how about that first twist, the revelation that Vicky is the woman being interviewed? It starts in the opening scene, which I see as pretty much a mood setter. It almost functions as its own short film that takes you through all the steps of horror. The discomfort of seeing the woman's disfigured face, the tension when you see her lurch forward, and finally the climax with the movie's first bloody kill. The woman's laugh, combined with the effects of both her facial prosthetics and the ones she rips off Mindy, leaves such an impression you could shut the movie off there, walk away, and you'd already have enough nightmare fuel. But if you decide to keep the movie on, this scene tells you exactly the sort of movie you're in for. And it tells you the sort of carnage that awaits the protagonists we're about to meet, Dawn and Tara. One thing I didn't talk much about in my All Hallows Eve review is the effects, but they're important and get more room to shine in this movie. I can't say they look realistic because the movie is showing me things I've never seen before, so I have no basis for a comparison, but I can say they feel physical. CGI is used sparingly and only where needed, so the focus remains on the practical, the stuff that's really there, and it's impressive. Thanks to, I think, a couple of factors. One, Leone himself personally crafts a lot of the makeup and effects in his movies. I have to imagine that helps him as the director to more closely realize his vision. And two, this movie is unrestrained. They didn't aim for an R rating. They allowed the movie to go into unrated territory. So Leone lets his imagination run wild and takes a personal hand to ensure it's properly represented on screen. The biggest example, of course, is the hacksaw scene. Again, I censored this in the recap, but in the context of commentary, I think it's a little more palatable. So yeah, how does Art dispatch Tara's friend Dawn? He saws her in half, vertically, basically turning her into a human V. Now, I'm not going to pretend Leone is the first one who ever thought to portray ultra-violence or gore on screen, but there's something different about the way he does it. On one level, he just brings a personal talent and passion that spits in the face of a low budget. But also important is the context. Horror, slashers especially, will often offer up kills to satisfy the audience's bloodlust. Characters are made to be unlikable or underdeveloped, so we don't feel too bad when they die, though often they're underdeveloped or poorly acted unintentionally. Either way, we don't mourn when they die. Instead, we look forward to it with that morbid curiosity. How's Jason gonna kill the next one? There is an element of that in Terrifier. There's definitely a curiosity to how Art will dispatch each of his victims. But the movie itself plays it straight. Tara and Dawn don't really have character arcs. There isn't a whole lot of character development, and we don't get to know them all that well. But they do feel like real people. We spend enough time with them before the killing starts to get a feel for their personalities, the way they talk, and their relationships with each other. They felt genuine to me and likable. I couldn't help but think of Rob Zombie's Halloween, because one place he went wrong is in trying to write teens who talk like teens today. I don't know how young people talk today. Maybe the way they were written is 100% accurate, but they were really annoying. And I couldn't stand to listen to them, and as a result, of course I didn't connect with them or care when bodies started dropping. Tara and Dawn were the exact opposite. They joked around and they were sometimes crass, just like those other characters, but it didn't feel over the top. And even when they poked fun at each other, there was a clear bond between them, which made them likable. Dawn could be at risk of coming off obnoxious. For example, when she throws her arm around Art and takes a selfie with him. I could imagine in another movie yelling at the screen, "What's wrong with this idiot? She's obviously going to get herself killed." But in Terrifier, you can tell it comes from a genuine good place. It shows her confidence, and the reason she's taking that selfie is to make Tara feel better. Her friend is worried there's something sinister about this clown. Dawn assumes he's just a creep in a costume, and figures that publicizing his presence would make him too uncomfortable to bother them too much. There's a lot packed into that moment. It tells us a bit about who Dawn is, and it puts that bond between her and Tara on display. It shows how Dawn is willing to do something a little uncomfortable to put her friend at ease. All that to say, characters who feel real, especially when they're likable, combined with ultra-violence, makes for real horror. So when Dawn gets cut in half, sure, maybe a part of you can't look away because you're just curious. How will Leone render that on screen with practical effects? But at the same time, it turns your stomach. In general, this points to Leone's craft. He understands the inner workings of a good slasher. He isn't trying to reinvent it. Instead, he is trying to execute the formula perfectly, while maximizing every variable. Preview the danger before we meet the characters? Check. That's done with the talk show host in brutal, memorable fashion. Introduce some characters and make them feel real, while that danger looms ever closer. Check. And that variable is pushed further because just like the Ninth Circle, it's Halloween. So Dawn especially puts up with Art's antics more than she might on any other night. When she taunts him repeatedly, that builds even more tension, because we know what she doesn't. The danger is real, and she is just setting herself up for a particularly brutal death. Of course, the most obvious variable Leone pushes is the kills themselves. They aren't quick and painless, they are gory and drawn out with the effects to back it up. Leone was inspired here by Italian horror, specifically the movie Suspiria. That movie opens with a similarly drawn out kill, where the villain stabs a woman over and over, to the point where her actual heart is exposed, and then he stabs that too. But Leone doesn't just stick to the formula. By understanding it and executing it, he can also subvert it here and there. Tara, for example, has all the makings of the final girl. She's the cautious one who immediately identifies Art as a threat. She's the one who drinks a little less and stays a little closer to sober than her friend Dawn. And she's the one who survives an encounter with Art. Then, in a single moment, Art violates slasher conventions by drawing a gun when he's backed into a corner, something Leone experimented with in the Terrifier short film as well. It often feels like slasher villains have their own internal rules. They usually have a weapon of choice that lets them get close to their victims, and you never see them draw a gun. There are probably a few reasons for that. Killing with a knife, machete, or a glove with finger knives means the bad guy getting up close and personal. It means more sneaking and approaching, which is better for building tension. Guns are also something we're desensitized to with their overabundance in action movies, and in a way, they seem too clean, compared to the gore Art can inflict with a knife, whip, or hacksaw. But violating that rule, when Art is left with no other options, makes him a little scarier than those other slasher villains, because it says he doesn't have any rules. Sure, he'll toy with his victims because he enjoys it, but at the end of the day, getting the job done is more important. It makes the odds feel even more stacked against the main characters. Personally, I also find these indications of real thought behind his actions to be really disturbing. For example, once he has Tara, he uses Dawn's phone to text Vicky and gets her to come around the back of the building. Again, you never picture Jason Voorhees or Michael Myers sending a text, and if they did, it would violate their mystique. It would make them feel too normal, the same way using a gun would. I think Art gets away with it because his mind is still so alien to us. The way he takes such glee in others' suffering, or the way he can meticulously saw a person to pieces without any hesitation, all while staying in character as a mime. That insanity, combined with these moments of seeming lucidity, make him scarier to me because it implies a working mind, someone who is fully aware of who they are and what they're doing, as opposed to an almost inhuman force of nature like Michael Myers by his other name, The Shape. And of course, even when Art uses a gun, he finds a way to draw it out with the same brutality as any of his other weapons. She survives the first bullet in her cheek. She has to lie there, aware that her end is imminent, and then he shoots her a few more times than necessary. We see all the details and gore. Leone doesn't linger on it in an overly gratuitous way, but we have a look, and it ensures that once Vicky finds her, it is as disturbing as possible. The use of a gun, killing the character who by all indications was going to be the final girl. These are a couple of surprises Leone uses to violate the formula and make a familiar subgenre a little less familiar, while also honoring it and taking it as far as he can. Finally, there's the fate of the only survivor, Vicky. A typical slasher will have one character get away, and then maybe we revisit them in a sequel and get a glimpse at how the experience affected them. In Terrifier, Leone discovers a new fate, one maybe worse than death. At the end, the cops find Art in the act of consuming Vicky's face, and then they realize, my God, she's still alive. Soon after that, we realize the twist, that this experience has so traumatized her, it's driven her to madness and violence that reflects Art's own. Or perhaps his evil has infected her somehow, in a supernatural sense. His resurrection at the morgue certainly indicates larger forces at play. That in itself isn't an entirely original idea, evil transferring from one character to another. Even the Halloween franchise played with it in a couple of its entries. But the addition of the new face Art's given her, and the twist where you realize the inevitability of this tragedy, that Tara, Dawn, and Vicky never stood a chance, it all helps the ending to land with more impact and haunt you long after the credits roll. Now, as I said about the short in All Hallows Eve, This is still a movie I would only recommend to a select few. For many, the fun in a typical slasher is what helps to make them more palatable. Not everyone wants a slasher where the kills are appropriately disgusting. This movie isn't devoid of fun. Art is a killer mime, after all. But as I said before, Leone always brings it back to darkness. The kills hurt, and the deaths are mourned. The lack of any real character development also means less to distract you from the pure tension and fear. There are no subplots or arcs other than trying to survive this clown. That also makes this movie a little harder to swallow. And finally, like the short films, this one is mostly set in unpleasant places. I'll admit, by the end of the runtime, I felt a little claustrophobic in this rat-infested building. It makes it a more nightmarish movie, where you're in the killer's domain, rather than the killer invading your space. But it does also make for a more trying viewing experience, with no interstitials to break it up. There's also one other area where I think the movie struggles a little. Like the short, there are few characters other than the protagonist, which does create a sense that she is particularly unsafe. A larger cast means more of a buffer, more victims between the main character and the killer. But here, it's pretty much just Tara, Dawn, the exterminator, and the clown. I found the additions of the homeless woman and the exterminator's boss a little distracting, like the movie is in search of more victims to pass the runtime until Art gets to Tara and eventually Vicky. Though the addition of the homeless woman did enable that one creepy sequence, where Art strips naked and borrows her hair and chest, it admittedly feels like an odd diversion in the movie, but also strangely appropriate, a small window into the mind of Art the Clown. When the woman cradles him and he sucks his thumb, I genuinely think a part of him embraced the moment, enjoying a motherly touch. But he's a mime. Perhaps his way of understanding the world is mimicry. He processes this new concept of motherhood by superficially mimicking it, taking the things that she has and he doesn't, then cutting them off and wearing them. Briefly summing up my view on Terrifier, it's made by someone who has seen a lot of slasher movies. He understands why the good ones work. He knows the formula, and he executes it as best he can, while pushing every variable as far as it can go. The tension, how long can you draw it out? How close can you let the killer get while he taunts his prey? And the violence, how far can you push it? Overall, I'd say it was a mostly successful experiment, but that lack of real character arcs and the focus on one grimy location do make it a challenging viewing experience, one I'm not likely to repeat too often. So where do you go from here? The short and All Hallows Eve functioned as a proof of concept, then Terrifier executed on it. Now what? Let's watch 2022's Terrifier 2 and find out. Halloween night. The morgue. Art the Clown has just been resurrected. His first order of business is brutally murdering the coroner. Next is the laundromat, where he strips down to clean his outfit. That's when he makes a new friend. The entity which resurrected him appears as a little pale girl, like Art dressed as a clown and equally silent, though seemingly invisible to all except him. 1 year later, Sienna Shaw prepares her Halloween costume, a winged hero, in homage to a sketch her father made before he passed, complete with the sword he once gave her. The one blight on the upcoming holiday is her brother Jonathan. His tastes have taken a grim turn. He appears fascinated by the Miles County Massacre and has chosen its perpetrator as his costume, the Miles County Clown, Art. That night, she dreams of that clown. She watches him mow down the cast of a children's show that came on as she fell asleep, one with a memorable jingle, reminding you to come by the Clown Cafe, where the food's a little funny. Sienna herself is nearly killed until she finds the courage to reach into a cereal box. Despite the bugs and pointy things inside it, she pulls from it the sword her father gave her, and just in time uses it to block Art's miniature flamethrower. Having defeated Art in this dream, Sienna has passed a divine test, and whatever force administered it now imbues her sword with power, though the weapon's baptism is a fiery one, and Sienna wakes to find her cabinet and homemade wings ablaze. Her mom puts the fire out, and of course blames her daughter for leaving the candles burning all night, but Sienna is sure she put them out. In her room, she digs that sword out of the ashes and finds it unblemished. The next day, it is Jonathan's turn to meet the clown, only he is awake when it happens. In the hallway at school, he sees Art and even the little pale girl playing with a dead possum and its innards. The two clowns smile at the boy and toss him the carcass. He runs right into the principal. She sees him with blood on his hands, and down the hall, that dead possum. With the clowns no longer in sight, of course she blames him. And when his mom finds out, of course he is banned from any Halloween activities that night. Sienna's day is only going slightly better. She's still haunted by that nightmare, but at least has the support of her close friends, Allie and Brooke. Though she nearly has a panic attack when they tell her what happened to Monica Brown last night, how the talk show host interviewed Victoria Hayes, the Miles County survivor, before ending up in the hospital minus a face. After school, her day gets worse. With her own wings burned, she heads to a costume shop for a replacement and runs into the clown from her nightmares. She wants to believe it isn't him, just a guy wearing a costume in poor taste, but deep down, she knows. After she leaves, the store clerk finds it out firsthand, dying by the clown's signature brutality. Back home, Sienna finds out what happened to her father's sketchbook, the one that went missing after he died. Jonathan has had it all along, and he finally shows her why he's taken such an interest in Art the Clown, because apparently their father did. His sketchbook is filled with articles relating to him, the death of 10-year-old Emily Crane at the local carnival, the same little pale girl Jonathan saw with Art. Of course, last year's Miles County massacre, not just articles, but also sketches, one of Art himself, and one of the hero which inspired Sienna's costume. In this sketch, she has defeated Satan himself and holds his decapitated head victoriously. Jonathan just knows that something bad will happen tonight, Halloween night, and he believes Dad gave Sienna that sword for a reason. Somehow, their dad saw this coming. Sienna doesn't want to believe any of it, so that night she doesn't stay home, cower, or hide. Instead, she does what she's been looking forward to, partying with her best friend Brooke and debuting the costume she worked months on. Though their friend Allie isn't answering her texts, Brooke tells Sienna to relax and have a good time for once. But in truth, Sienna is right to worry, because that evil force, that pale girl, guided Art to her friend's house. And if Allie is still alive, she likely hopes it won't be for much longer, considering the state Art left her in. Her mother got to see it firsthand when she came home to find what's left of her daughter, just before the clown attacked her too, and repurposed her skull as a candy bowl. But all Sienna knows is that her friend isn't answering the phone, and after a couple of drinks, she's feeling less concerned, though that might have more to do with the Molly Brooke snuck into one of those drinks. Back home, the grounded Jonathan gets in another fight with his mom. She still doesn't believe his story about a clown at the school, or his warning about the things he found in Dad's sketchbook, and she still blames him for the possum incident. Jonathan's had enough.
You're such a bitch!
After she smacks him, Jonathan runs out of the house. She feels bad about it until she sees her car, covered in pumpkin, egg, and shaving cream, and that same 5-letter word written on her windshield. It must have been Jonathan who did this. Jonathan himself is roaming the neighborhood when he spots that little girl again, with glowing, evil eyes. He runs back toward home. His mother, meanwhile, calls Sienna and can immediately tell she's drunk. They argue, and maybe it's the drug talking, but Sienna tells her mother that she loves her. It's a good thing she gets the chance to say it, because it is the last time they'll ever speak. Barbara wipes away the shaving cream to reveal the true perpetrator. Sitting in the car is a clown named Art. He points the shotgun at her. At the club, the pale girl now appears to Sienna too, and Molly or not, her good night is officially over. So is Jonathan's, when he finally reaches home to find the clown serving dinner to a corpse that used to be his mother. The boy runs upstairs and reaches for the sword, before Art gets the needle in his neck. Then takes that sword for himself. With Sienna's brother in hand, they have bait. Now it's time to draw in their prey. Sienna gets a call and hears Jonathan's voice on the line, telling her that he's at the carnival, that he needs help. At Sienna's insistence, Brooke's boyfriend Jeff takes them there, though she might have been a little more hesitant if she knew who she was really talking to. An evil apparition, the pale girl, apparently capable of mimicry. They get to the old carnival, and Sienna gets out of the car to go look for her brother, which gives Brooke a chance to tell Jeff her deal, how Sienna's father got a tumor that drove him mad. He started seeing things, became abusive, especially towards Sienna, and eventually took his own life. All side effects of grander forces channeling through him, the good, visions of a hero and that sword, and the bad, abusive impulses, a tumor. Sienna gets a text from the pale girl in the guise of Jonathan, telling her where to find him, inside a haunted house ride called the Terrifier. Back at the car, Jeff heads outside to relieve himself. The open fly makes it that much easier for Art to detach a particular appendage of his. And while Jeff rolls on the ground screaming, Brooke runs for her life. A life that is soon extinguished once Art catches up to her with a vial of acid and a spiked club. Sienna soon finds her friend's body and the clown. She only stares and trembles until she spots Jonathan, and an almost maternal instinct kicks in. She picks up a board with a nail in it and stabs it into the clown, giving her brother a chance to run. But their fight has only begun. Both take brutal beatings. Both are cut, yet Sienna keeps fighting. She puts Art's spiked club in the back of his head. He gets back up. When she can no longer fight, she still protects her brother, shielding him and taking the hits in his place when she has to. And she gets back up. This time, she sticks a rod through Art's skull. He keeps moving. He chokes her until Jonathan grabs the clown's gun and shoots him. It still isn't enough. And now they've run out of tries. Art puts Sienna's own sword through her stomach and pushes her into a hell portal below them, into a water tank. That's where she dies drowning, surrounded by the undead cast of the Clown Cafe. But in his hubris, what Art doesn't realize is that Sienna's sword, after their encounter in a dream, was imbued with power. Power which makes it capable of harming the evil formed as Art the Clown, and power which renders it incapable of harming the hero who wields it. It soon heals Sienna's wound and restores her life. Finally, she realizes the vision her father drew in that sketchbook, an angel who takes the head of Satan. Now, Sienna, with that sword, takes Art's head and saves her brother. It seems the clown is finally dead, though evil has other plans. The pale girl picks up the lifeless clown head and runs off with it. And later that night, Vicky, institutionalized after maiming the talk show host, gives spontaneous birth, not to a baby, but to a head, the living head of Art the Clown.
Wow, I have never seen a post-credits scene like that before. I gotta say, it's one of my favorite slasher resurrections. Jason got struck by lightning, Michael retconned his way back, Freddy escaped the movies, and at the end of Terrifier, Art had some flickering lights. But I guess resurrection works differently for him if he's actually beheaded. Apparently, Leone's original idea was to reveal Art's face has appeared on the back of Vicky's head. but shortly before the release of this movie, another movie beat them to the punch. I can't say which one because technically that'd be a spoiler, but if you have no idea what I'm talking about and aren't too worried about spoilers, just search Face on the Back of Head Horror, and you should find the movie. Anyway, with that idea taken, they had to think of something new, and they came up with this. One of the best parts of horror is that it allows filmmakers to run wild with their imagination, to show us new sights. The more bizarre, the better. I'd say that a deranged woman giving spontaneous birth to a serial killer clown's head is high on that list. And I can't wait to see Terrifier 3 to find out what happens next. Does that head grow a new body, like in Deadpool? Or do they attach the living head to the dead body and it springs back to life? Or will Art have to harvest his victim's parts to build a new body, like that Treehouse of Horror episode where Professor Frink resurrects his dad?
Hey, you can't have that.
Lost your spine, huh?
By the way, you might have noticed some stuff in my recap that sounded like editorializing. For example, in the text of the movie, nowhere does it explicitly state that Sienna's dream was a divine test, or that the little pale girl is a manifestation of the same evil force that resurrected Art. None of that stuff is in the movie, but I didn't make it up, and it isn't fan theory. That all comes from Damien Leone himself on the Blu-ray commentary. He didn't want to explain everything, but in these cases, I think he's really just confirming stuff the movie already implies. A couple of other points he brought up that I found interesting. He made it clear that there was nothing special about the sword, until that divine test. By Sienna proving she's up to the task of representing good in this battle, they, whoever they are, gave that sword power. As we saw, no other weapon is effective against Art. He's shot, stabbed, and just keeps getting back up. But now, that sword has the ability to harm him. And the reason Art is impervious to everything else is thanks to that evil force which resurrected him. Just like the sword, I don't think Art was anything special before the end of Terrifier. Up to that point, he was just an evil guy who dressed up as a clown. And just as Sienna passed a divine test, Art passed another kind of test, proving he's the vile sort of person deserving of resurrection and power from this evil. That isn't something Leone spelled out, but it's the impression I get. Terrifier 2 clearly embraces the supernatural more than its predecessor, which didn't really have it until the ending. Personally, I'm a fan of that choice. I generally like supernatural in my horror because it opens up more storytelling possibilities and violating our understanding of reality, showing things that should be impossible, is a great way to induce fear. Now, it does come with some risks too. Not every story benefits from the addition of the supernatural. I think Michael Myers, for example, works in a more ambiguous place. I've also seen way too many horror movies where the characters find that one character who has dealt with all this before, or they find an ancient book, and it just spells everything out. The demon hunting you is named blank, and the only way to kill it is by finding the blank and completing this ritual. It's a cliche, and as you spell out the rules, the thing inevitably becomes less scary. I think Terrifier 2 does it right. Leone has clearly thought about the underlying rules, but he never spells them out in the movie. There's no scene explaining who that little girl is, but there are hints, like the article in their father's journal. The way Sienna's sword spontaneously combusts and is then unscathed. By the end, you get a sense that there are opposing forces of good and evil at work, but those forces mostly remain mysterious. And you don't uncover any rules until you think back on the movie after watching it, or listen to Leone's commentary, or listen to a guy on YouTube who listened to Leone's commentary. The closest we get to that character who explains everything is Sienna and Jonathan's dad. But I love how that's handled too. He has no answers written in his journal, just sketches and clipped out articles. That feels right to me. If there are supernatural or cosmic forces out there and they interact with us, it feels appropriate they wouldn't communicate through clear language because they aren't human. They are something we can't even begin to comprehend. So when they communicate, it should be through feelings and images. And their meddling in the world of man should have unforeseen consequences. Maybe it grows a tumor on your brain, and maybe it opens a window for other forces to reach out. Or maybe it acts as a beacon for an alien visitor. Yeah, you can see Leone was already toying with this idea back in All Hallows Eve, where her husband painted art in a trance. The good force sent these visions to Sienna's father, inadvertently opening the door for evil to take hold as well, growing him a tumor and driving him to that abusive behavior we hear about. The increased presence of the supernatural also points to one reason why Terrifier 2 is one of the more successful slasher sequels. It is far from a retread of the first movie. It adds new elements to keep the series fresh, without feeling like a betrayal of what came before. There are other slashers which have tried this and failed miserably. Halloween, for example. It went full-on supernatural with later sequels and it felt jarring. Terrifier took a more gradual approach and integrated the elements well so they're actually adding something. Like the Clown Cafe sequence. There are many tones of horror. Terrifier aimed for a gritty, isolated nightmare, but there are other types of nightmares too. The surreal ones where you aren't isolated because there are other people there, but those people aren't helping you for some reason, and there's just something off about them. Maybe they happily chow down on candy while a killer clown slaughters them all. I love the addition of this sequence, and just adding more flavors to Art's menu of terrors. The supernatural also enables the addition of the little pale girl, now giving Art someone to interact with. In the first movie, the only people he meets are potential victims. Now, he's got a friend. A creepy friend whose upper and bottom teeth have swapped places, and she has weirdly hairy arms. More fun tidbits I picked up from the commentary. She is such a creepy addition that just adds one more flavor of terror. The wide eyes, the weird grin, and the way she just stares at you, sometimes with an evil glow to remind you that this body is simply a form that evil has taken. I also have to point out, just because it's a cool detail, but Terrifier opens with Art watching the interview on TV. This movie leads up to that moment, and we find out the little pale girl is with him watching. We just couldn't see her in the first movie. As a purveyor of timelines, I always appreciate when things link together in an interesting way, especially when they add new context to a moment we didn't have before. Another interesting tidbit from the commentary is in the final battle, when Sienna gets dropped into what Leone calls a hell portal. Again, there's a rule clearly hinted at but not spelled out. The good guys can't kill Art without their divine weapon. Well, there's a flip side to that. Art cannot vanquish Sienna through normal means either. Instead, he has to lock away her soul in this special place. And that's what we're seeing when she's dropped into the water tank. Physically, he just drops her into a hole. What we see here is the destination of her soul. This is some version of hell. That's how it's able to include the set and characters from her dream. Originally, Leone intended to have Sienna drowning over and over, the implication being that her soul will be trapped here for eternity, forever tormented through unending drowning. But that's hard to show on film. If the drowning never reaches that conclusion where you stop moving, it's hard to understand exactly what's going on. So instead, we only see her die once, which I do think obscures some of Leone's original intent. The fact that we actually see her drown and die makes this feel like a real physical place where her body is physically dying. But whether or not Leone's original intent comes through doesn't really diminish the scene for me. It's equally disturbing either way. Now, I've talked a lot about these supernatural elements and haven't really talked about the movie as a whole. In part, that's because a lot of what I said about the first movie applies equally in the sequel. In terms of the slasher formula, this movie repeats it. We open with an introduction to the dangers ahead when Art murders the coroner, and now that danger is even greater since it's established that this clown is backed by a powerful evil force. Then, just like Halloween or Terrifier 1, he stalks the main character, building tension as that danger closes in. And just like the first movie, since we're on Halloween, Art can be written off as a guy in a costume, meaning people have slightly increased tolerance for his antics. It lets him perform a bit, like in the costume shop where he's got different glasses on every time Sienna looks over at him. It's funny, but also unpredictable, because you don't know when it'll suddenly take a dangerous turn. It's Leone milking the character and premise for as much tension as he can. And again, the kills are as sick and twisted as possible. I already praised the practical effects in the first movie. Of course, the same praise applies here. But one thing I'd add is that this movie is a great example of how practical can be combined with CG to great effect. CGI gets a bad rap these days thanks to its overuse, but it does allow for things that would be almost impossible otherwise. So one thing Leone does a few times in this movie is build a dummy, then digitally graft an actor's face onto it. He does this when Allie is being absolutely brutalized, same with the employee at the costume store. When you're ripping apart a dummy, the face is usually the big giveaway that it's fake. Because even if the face looks real when it's perfectly still, the subtle movements like twitching eyes or facial muscles are hard to get right. So that's a place where you can make the effects 90% practical, then use CG for that last 10% to fully sell the effect. Speaking of Allie, Terrifier had the hacksaw scene, that's the one everyone talks about. This movie has Allie. I think it was the most brutal kill I've ever seen. And actually, I shouldn't say kill because the most horrifying thing of all, just like the girl in the Terrifier short or Vicky in the movie, she isn't dead. Her mother finds her still alive. I've seen that in horror movies before, where you find what you think is a body, and then, my God, they're still alive. But it still freaks me out every time. I said earlier that these movies do have some fun, but Leone always brings it back to true horror. He specifically said that he doesn't want this series to turn into Nightmare on Elm Street, where once you get 6 movies in, the kills are gags and Freddy is a cartoon. More than the first movie, Terrifier 2 has some fun, like the entire clown cafe sequence and even the alley scene. It's absolutely brutal. He scalps her, rips her back open, tears an arm off, and more, then pours bleach and salt on the wounds. Brutal, yes, but also so over the top, it does start to become cartoonish. Especially once the salt and bleach come out, my mind sort of breaks from the scene. I stop conceptualizing what I'm seeing as events in a story, and instead I'm thinking about the filmmaker. Like, wow, I can't believe how far you're taking this. There's also the way her body comes apart when Art is ripping into her. It does start to feel like Art is pulling a dummy apart more than an actual human being. It feels a little too easy. And I think that was probably the right move. Without these little reminders that what you're seeing is not real, the movie might cross that line of unpleasantness where it's unwatchable. The other kills also have a sick humor to them, like turning Allie's mother into a human jack-o'-lantern, then seeing Art hand out candy and admonishing a kid who tries to take more than one. Or in the opening sequence, Art rips out the coroner's eye and then sticks it into his own socket for a bit. But as I said, though this movie cracks a smile, it always brings it back to some kind of reality, mainly through other characters. For example, Allie's mother finds her daughter still barely alive in the aftermath of Art's brutality. We see her reaction and there's nothing funny about it. It's pure shock and horror. Some kills are played totally straight, like Sienna and Jonathan's mother, which I think was important because that's the biggest loss these characters face. Her death is subsequently played for laughs, but only for Art. When Jonathan finds her, the clown shoves mashed potatoes into what's left of her head, and the boy is there to see it with his own eyes. That's obviously traumatizing, and that becomes the overwhelming emotion of the scene. Art kills his victims slow, mocks them while doing it, and once they're gone, his mockery continues. well past the point most slasher villains would have moved on. It's another way Leone takes the familiar formula and doesn't necessarily change it, but attempts to increase each variable to their maximum value. And he adds an ingredient lacking in many slashers, including to some extent in this movie's predecessor: character development. It's not a necessity if your goal is just to be a funhouse horror movie, the equivalent of visiting a haunted house or a roller coaster thrill ride. But creating full-fledged characters elevates the movie so that it has more emotional impact. And in the case of something like Terrifier, filled with so much awfulness, it's almost like a comfort blanket between the horrors. It adds a dash of pleasantness that makes Terrifier 2 so much more accessible than the first movie or All Hallows Eve. This movie quickly paints a picture of Sienna, Jonathan, their mother, and the relationships between them. We first meet Sienna working on her costume. The fact that she's building her own costume from scratch gives her character personality. It also displays talent and hard work, which immediately makes her likable. Her brother Jonathan is intriguing and a little scary from the start. He wants to dress up as Art for Halloween and seems to be obsessed with the murders. Of course, that worries Sienna, but there's a complexity to their relationship that makes it feel real. She shares her concerns and can be a little mean to her brother, but at the same time, when he asks for glue for his clown costume, she lends it to him, because at the end of the day, she still supports her little brother. You could imagine a lesser movie painting their relationship as entirely one note. He's the freak younger brother, so she makes fun of him for it, and that's all there is to it. In reality, there is usually more nuance. It also feels true to life when we realize why Jonathan is so fascinated by all this. The scraps and sketches in their father's notebook. He's afraid of Art the Clown. That could manifest in many ways. He could run from it and cower, or he could put on a clown costume as a defense mechanism, show reverence to Art, and perhaps he'll be spared. He could research the massacre and try to understand this monster, and most of all, he could not admit that he's scared. That would make his fear real. Without that admission, it leaves everyone guessing. So to Sienna and to us initially, we worry maybe Jonathan looks up to the clown. On the other hand, their mother did feel a little one-note. Nearly every line is delivered in this exasperated manner to emphasize how stressed she is, trying to raise these two kids alone while working. Not helping matters is that her son wants to dress as a real-life serial killer and was found at school with a dead possum. Her demeanor is understandable. She would be very stressed. But it also becomes exhausting when that's the only side of her we see. I would have appreciated a couple of quieter scenes to paint a fuller picture of who she is before she meets her gruesome end. Ultimately, the focus is on Sienna. Not only is she likable and a character with personality, but she even goes through some change. She starts off not exactly meek, but also not exactly brimming with confidence. Jonathan believes she's destined for more, but she is certain that while she might dress up like the hero their father drew, they couldn't be more different. By the end of the movie, she literally becomes that hero. There's something satisfying in watching a character change, but the challenge is making it believable, because in real life, change is tough and usually takes a long time. But the right set of circumstances can turn life into a pressure cooker, where you either rise to the occasion or fall apart. If there is a spark inside you, that's when it turns into a raging inferno. Sienna has that spark. We see it in her dream. Then Art and his new friend fan the flames. They kill her friends, they kill her mother, and they threaten her life. But the final trigger is Jonathan. If she won't fight for herself, she will at least fight to protect her family. And you see it in this scene. She is shaking like a leaf in front of the clown, until she spots Jonathan and moves to protect him. Standing up to the clown gives her and her brother confidence. They both fight back after that. Her resurrection and return from hell finally gets her over the line. It gets her where she needs to be to take the clown's head. It's a satisfying journey, made all the more satisfying because it isn't just one character changing, but also the dynamics in several relationships. At first, Sienna is worried about her brother, and their mother defends him. Then their mother is worried when Jonathan comes home with stories of a clown. Now the mother is worried and Sienna is the one to defend him. Tragically, their mother dies before she can fully reconcile with her son, but in the end, his bond with Sienna has grown stronger than it's ever been. Now, none of this would work without strong performances from both Elliot Fulham and Lauren Lavera, who in my mind makes Sienna stand out as one of the best slasher heroes, right up there next to Laurie Strode. Of course, a hero needs a villain, and David Howard Thornton does such a great job infusing art with a sadistic brutality that makes Joker look like Ronald McDonald by comparison. Sienna and Jonathan fighting together and vanquishing evil, at least for now. It's an unusually positive ending to a horror movie, especially one that follows the brutality of both this movie and its predecessor. I also have to mention the unusual length of the movie, just under 2 hours and 20 minutes. That is rare for a slasher, and it's impressive that it doesn't exhaust you by the end of it. I think it's only possible thanks to the variety offered by this movie. It isn't just a fight for survival in a single location, there's also a grander battle between good and evil unfolding, and the characters are on a journey. Like we talked about, they grow and change. As a result, the movie offers a variety of tones and feelings. Otherwise, like Terrifier, it would only be some combination of tension and dread, which would become exhausting at 2 hours and 20 minutes. So far, Terrifier 2 is definitely the apex of this series. It's where Leone not only executes the slasher formula, but adds some variety on top of it. If he can do it again with Terrifier 3, changing up that variety and keeping things fresh, I will be really impressed. And I can't wait to see it for myself. Stay tuned to hear my thoughts. In the meantime, that concludes our journey into darkness this evening. For those of you who survived the journey with your sanity intact, feel free to comment below with your thoughts on Terrifier. For the rest of you, good luck, and don't say I didn't warn you. Happy Halloween, and take care.